How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. The surface of Scythia's rage calmed after an initial storming march away from the chasm's edge. The rest of Gorgonbane had followed closely, while trying to give her space. She finally slowed her mad march and seemed to fall into a more calculating mode. What was she thinking, though? No one else could say. Pierce wanted to guess that it was all just as simple as revenge. Something priceless had been taken from her, and she wanted an eye for an eye, death for death. Though this was the teaching of the glorious paths, that one wronged should be repaid or avenged, storming up to Cash in his fortress did not seem the most prudent solution. Scythia was a legend, though. A heroine among the greatest of heroes and myths in Overland. Pierce believed that she would see reason before it was too late. And if she didn't, well, he would still fight by her side.
What I can't figure out, Agrithor was saying to S, is where those greater monstrosities came from. You can't just hide something that big, especially the last one.
He trailed off, thinking about it. It really was mind-boggling, Pierce agreed. They must be from something deeper in the cosmic depths, S said. From places I've never been.
Could he have other Forge Masters, Sev?
Agrithor asked the big grey man.
Could there be other teams working on the monstrosities that you didn't know about?
Sev shrugged. It is possible, Master Agrithor, but not likely. I have never known there to be secrets kept between Forge Masters. And anyhow, the monstrosities are not built, they are harvested.
They're plants,
Agrithor said incredulously. Sev gave out something like a chuckle. Many believe they are like the undead, that we Forge Masters construct them from those killed in battle or otherwise. How would we then cause them to grow to such impressive statures? I could not imagine. So what are they? Asked S. I too have never understood. They're born in the ground, like plants, I suppose, or the crystals that grow in the deep caves of the earth. We find them, excavate them, and train them for their chosen tasks, Sev said. So they are creatures, Pierce said. I mean, they have life. Such as it is, Sev said. But what life they have is not complex. It is trivial to fill their minds with imperatives and procedures. It is easy to teach them to feel anger and hatred towards one's enemies, or so I am told. I have never trained one myself.
All right, said Agrithor. So, they are grown and harvested. But still wouldn't you have known about the larger breeds? If you say Cash is so forthcoming about his plans, why would he not share this information with you?
That I cannot say, Sev answered. Yes, the Underlord is open with his ideas and goals, but I did not mean to suggest to you that he tells us everything. Would a lord discuss the dinner menu for a feast with the town's blacksmith? Perhaps if one had known to ask, Cash would have shared details concerning the new monstrosities. How can one know to ask, though, when such plans are beyond or outside of one's station?
Fair enough, said Agrithor. Might have been nice for us if you did know, though.
Indeed, said Sev. So either he sought these things out, said S, or found them by happy accident. They must be as easy to control as the smaller ones. So of course he saw fit to capitalize upon their great power. Why use them to invade, though? It seems he has used a combination of structural durability enchantments with the great height and strength of the ultra monstrosity.
I sure hope there's only one,
Agrathor interjected. To literally push portions of the Underlands to the surface, S continued. That has its own implications on our cosmology, but let's set it aside for now. Why not just tear all of Overland down? And why even do that? There is little on our small continent that amounts to more than what he already controls. We have the sun, but beyond that I can think of nothing else he would desire strongly enough to make the conquest worthwhile. It has to be the people, Pierce said. Whatever his goal, he must need slaves or subjects to see it through. That is a good thought, said S. It may be that he simply desires a greater empire, someone to build monoliths in worship to his name, human slaves to carry precious materials from the far reaches of the world back to him in his fortress.
He wouldn't be the first madman to harbour that simple lust, said Agrathor. But there's something to the supplanting of one city with another. Especially the temple with his testadel. I can't say what that something is, but it's just too specific an action to not have meaning to him. You can ask him when my hands are at his throat, Scythia said lowly. It was the first time anyone had heard her speak in hours. She ceased her march and sighed. All right, she said. You've made your point. Who? Asked Pierce. Yeah, I sure didn't say anything, said Agrathor.
Scythia looked at each of them in turn. All of you. You didn't have to say anything, surely you know that. S nodded. My grief is far from sated, Scythia said, but we need a plan. Cash himself is the heart of the machine, even setting my husband's death aside. She had to take a moment to breathe deeply. And that of the first. This invasion must be stopped. If possible, we must also eradicate his holds on the surface. The sheer power of that ultra-monstrosity shows us how dire the situation really is. Given time, Cash could dismantle or supplant the entirety of Overland if he wished.
Good to hear you talking again, Scythia,
Agrathor said.
What do you propose?
We have to figure out where we are and get back up to the Underlands, Scythia said. Pierce started. He should have thought of it, but his mind had been drawn to other things. Namely, he was still trying to work out what felt wrong about the assassination atop Chasm verge. Meanwhile, Scythia had worked out something vital that should have been obvious to everyone else. Up to the Underlands, Pierce said. We've been here for hours and there's still no moon. S, can you fold someplace familiar and tell us where we are? Scythia asked. S shook her head. It is a peculiar skill which requires knowledge of both origin and destination. I cannot use the power to leave this place since I do not know where I am. Scythia nodded, thinking. We got thrown down from the surface, Scythia said. But I've never known or heard of the Underlands being quite this dark. The moon is always in the sky. That foul giant must have brought us down even lower.
I had no idea there was anything lower, said Agrathor.
I don't think anyone did, said Scythia. Unless the Forge Master knew. She looked to Sev. He shook his head. If the Underlord were to keep anything from his people, said Sev, it would be something as earth-shaking as that revelation. Makes you wonder how deep the world does go, said Pierce. Everyone looked at him.
You'd have fun finding out, wouldn't you, kid? Agrathor asked, while the rest of us just worry what things worse than monstrosities might crawl up from the cosmic depths.
And why it would go so deep, Pierce said. I guess that would be S's domain? I've only ever considered notions of skill and ability, S said. Never subterranean geography. Pierce was beginning to get a picture in his head. The world as a series of layers, shells within shells, condensing downward, expanding upward. He knew it was pointless, but he spoke the words anyway. What if there's more above Overland? Pierce said. What if what we call the surface really isn't?
Now don't go making up new myths just for the fun of it, kid,
said Agrithor. Just thinking, Pierce said. We would be someone else's Underlanders. A strange and humbling thought, S acceded. Cash found out about this lower level, Pierce said. Maybe he discovered a higher one too. Maybe he needs a foothold on Overland to push up even further.
This is all beside the point,
said Scythia, uncharacteristically impatient. Whatever arcane knowledge Cash has gained, he is harming innocent people. We have to stop him. No one disagreed with that. So we have to find a way back up, even if we're wrong about this being a third layer of the Earth, said Scythia. We must find a convergence, S said. If they connect the first two levels of the Earth, surely there will be some here as well. Can't you just fly up and see if we're right? Pierce asked. Gravity asserts itself exponentially as I rise, S said. Within a few thousand feet it would become far too taxing. But wait, said Scythia. If there are convergences here, why has no one ever discovered they could travel down from above? A puzzling observation, said S. Perhaps the machine does not function the way we have always assumed. I would say it is worth discovering for ourselves. The knowledge will be world-altering. I say, said Pierce, we track down that ultra monstrosity.
Don't say it, kid,
Agrithor groaned. And climb it, Pierce finished. Honestly, I'm surprised we can't hear it stomping around. If it's still on this level, and not down lower, we all must have been unconscious for some time. I believe we were, said S, and Pierce's idea is unconventional as usual, but not without merit.
Are you kidding? Agrithor said.
Convergences do not make a sound. The giant will make quite a loud one if we can get near enough. And if it is still on this theoretical third level, and not back in the Underlands. It's true, said Scythia. These are the only options we have, it seems. We might as well pursue both of them at once, since the procedure will be the same. And what's the procedure? Said Pierce. Well, said Scythia, S is airborne, so she can search around us all in a spiral. Each of us carries a light, so we can spread out in a wide formation as we move inland. As long as S is in your sight, you should be in formation, and she can let any of us know if we wander.
You can feel the convergences when you're near, said Agrithor, and we'll hear the giant if it comes within range. You're right, Scythia. It should work.
Anyone have anything to add? Scythia asked. No one did. Let's get to it then. No need to stop and rest. We don't have food or water anyhow. The four earthbound companions formed up in a cross shape, with Scythia at its head. Pierce got what everyone agreed to call the east point. S floated up above them, illuminated by her glowing spheres and circling around her comrades slowly. Pierce kept his ears open, set his nerves to listen for the faint hum of a convergence, and let his mind wander. The world was of 3 layers. He was certain of that much now. The notion had exploded in his mind, and he felt a strong surety that there were more than 3. His imagination had expanded, and he had no trouble seeing the possibility of an endless number of nested shells stretching out beyond what everyone had thought were the highest heavens. This meant so many things. It meant that the sun was inside the level that Overland was on. It meant that not every level was subject to the lateral restrictions of the chasm. It meant that the resources of the world were far less finite than people had always assumed. It meant that the people of Overland had wrongly assumed themselves to be the pinnacle of the blacksmith's creations. There were things of far greater power below, and might be things innumerable in variety above. Not long ago, before Pierce had begun to train himself with adventures, he had worried to himself that Overland and the Underlands would someday be dry of adventure for him. Now he could see new possibilities. He could see that even one more layer to the world, whether above or below, would give him something to discover, and probably things to fight for the rest of his life. He would never be bored. He felt a slight pang of guilt at the joy and excitement these thoughts brought him as he walked along. All of Gorgonbane was still mourning the death of their leader, and yet Pierce could feel joy so soon. Was that okay? He certainly wouldn't speak of it out loud. In a small way, though, he realised that Axeborn was still alive somewhere, for that is what their religion taught. He had been completed, refined, tested and tempered. He was ready for the glorious parts, and certainly would not begrudge Pierce the happy expectations of his own journey down to find them for himself. Even legends had to rest eventually. It was hard for all of them to stop, to admit the exhaustion their bodies imposed upon their minds. Pierce thought he could go on a little further, but S insisted that everyone stop for a time. Agrathor stood sleepless watch as the others lay on the hard, dry ground. Pierce stole occasional glances at Scythia. She sat cross-legged, facing what they'd assumed was inland. She did not nod or sway in the slightest, still as a rock. Something startled him, a presence. A gap in time opened in his mind. He'd fallen asleep. "Sorry, Pierce," said S, putting a hand on his arm. She knelt down beside him. "I heard you muttering and thought you were awake." Pierce shook away the cobwebs and sat up. "What's up?" he asked. "Time to go?" S looked around. The only light came from a single one of her orbs, but Pierce could see everyone else still in their former positions. "Not quite yet," S answered. "No one is getting much rest, but this time was needed. Today was a hard day." "You're telling me," he said, cracking his sore back. "Feels like I got sat on by a monstrosity." S smiled. "Your tenacity in the face of dire odds is very endearing, Pierce. It has been a pleasure getting to know you." "You say it like you think this is the end," Pierce said. S shrugged. "It could be. In our line of work, many days could have been, no?" "Well, yeah. I've never been this low, though." "All right. No more bad jokes," she said. "That is the only one you are allowed." "Too bad," he said. "They're the only kind I've got." "I disagree," she said. "You have been nothing but pleasant since you joined us." Pierce shrugged. "It makes things easier, doesn't it?" "It does. Your demeanor, those bright eyes, they are magnetic." S kissed him. Her move surprised him. It was masterful, full of grace, sweeping away his mind and his emotions like the waters of flood day. The fullness of her lips completed his, and he received the kiss hungrily. S pulled back, and Pierce saw only the faintest impression of her face in the dark. Her white painted eyelids glistened with the orange light of her orb. Before anything else could happen, Pierce dove back into her, arms drawing her close, lost in her thick robes. He felt her embrace, but he couldn't feel her touch through his armor. He knew it must be awkward, but he had no intention of letting the moment go. He explored her lips, her tongue. His hands begged him to wander, but he kept them pressed against her lower back. Losing himself, he broke contact and kissed her cheeks. He'd been staring at them for days, imagining this. He felt them tense with a smile. He moved to the corner of her eye, that dark portal he'd so often wished to inhabit. He brushed her brow with his lips and kissed her forehead like a precious thing. S put 2 fingers under his chin and drew his mouth back down to hers for one final kiss, then pushed him away gently. Pierce's heart and mind raced with frantic desire. Had he done something wrong? "I've never," he started, but she put a finger to his lips. "It was lovely," S said, "but small servings leave the sweetest aftertastes." He couldn't see her smile, but he heard it. Something in him almost whined as she stood and moved away. He retained enough of his manhood to keep himself from begging like a puppy. S floated into the darkness, her form limned by faint orange light. Pierce melted to the dry ground in euphoria. He didn't fall asleep again. Thoughts of Axborn kept Pierce company once the rush of S had ebbed away. In just this span of days, the Cleaver had proven a worthy mentor, a shining beacon of good humour and better character. Pierce hesitated to allow himself thoughts of father figures, because that would mean thinking of his own, but he couldn't deny the sensation was there. Axborn was simply a good man. Which made it all the more difficult to watch Scythia deal with his death. She'd settled into warrior mode, leading the rest of them along in Axborn's stead, stolid and reasonable, but her yellow eyes were far too bright and communicative. Pierce saw the pain, the red veins and the dark circles underneath. She was devastated by this. Pierce almost pitied the enemy who had chosen to poke this particular Mother Dogrin. Pierce recalled Axborn's admiration for his wife. Their short time in the fallen Grondel seemed an age ago now, but a rare moment of quiet while marching through the middle of nowhere kept playing in his mind. They hadn't seen town or traveller in days, and Pierce had grown bored, as usual. So he sidled up next to Axborn and caught the big man's attention. "So, sir, I was wondering," Pierce said. "Yes," Axborn said as he scanned the empty horizon. "Well, everyone hears all the tales about Gorgonbane, and you figure they're mostly true." Axborn pulled a deep frown that made Pierce smile. "Or all true, but maybe missing some details? You filled in some of the gaps for me and I'm thankful, but I wondered if you'd share something I might never have heard before." "Huh!" Axborn bellowed. "The boy requests a tale, dear wife. How about we extol the greatness of Scythia of Chasm Reach?" "Please don't," she said, but there was a hint of a smile on her face. "She says that, but she loves hearing my voice," Axborn chortled. "She'll humour us at least." Axborn cracked his knuckles as if that would help to warm up his vocal cords. So, have you heard the one about the Battle of West Chasm? Pierce nodded. Scythia had single-handedly held a choke point on the approach to the big town, sparing it a surprise assault by a band of brigands. Okay. How about the sacking of Gunt? Pierce nodded again. Scythia had somehow infiltrated a troll fort called Gunt. She'd blown apart the gatehouse locking mechanisms and let a small mercenary army in to avenge raids on the nearby towns. Axborn, He pinched the bridge of his nose, then barked. Ha! I've got it! I was waiting for you to get around to that one, Scythia said. Heh! Look out, boy! You're together this long, they start reading your mind, Axborn stage whispered. Anyhow, I doubt you've heard of the time Scythia saved Chasm Reach, when she was only 9. Pierce's eyes lit up. That was a new one. By your leave, love, Axborn said. Scythia waved a hand. You enjoy yourself, Axie. Scythia's father was the mayor, Axborn said, always busy managing the state of the place. Comings and goings, trade, defence. Scythia had made a habit of sneaking out after him whenever he went to his office to practice her stealth. She would track him from parallel streets or alleyways, guessing when he might consider a detour, trying to get close if he stopped to speak with someone. This was without the amulet of silence, mind you. Scythia fingered the silver chain at her neck. Well, of course she was only a child, and one day she finally got caught. She'd guessed her father was taking a detour toward one of his favourite bakeries, and hung right to follow him at the next street. Yet there he was as she rounded the corner, in all his hard, long fatherliness. Scythia, he yelled at me. Scythia jumped in. Heh, Axborn chuckled. She always has to join in. It's not safe for you out here, he said. He knelt down beside me and whispered, I'm not the most popular mayor Chasm Reach has ever had. You know those children at the school that like to pick on you? I nodded. Well, I have people like that too, he said. And if they realise you're mine, they might just try to take you away from me. I was appalled, of course. Every child knows the songs and chants about the underwitches appearing in the dead of night to cart away children who aren't in their beds and stories like that. But to think that Overland as humans would kidnap a little girl to hurt her father, it was unconscionable. But she let herself be led home, and her father kept her under guard every morning until school began. For some time after that, Axborn said. It wasn't until the weeks before Flood Day that his watch grew lax, as his mind turned to the year's preparations. And it was a good thing too, said Scythia. Who knows what would have happened if I had still been under guard? The moment his grip loosened, I broke free of the house, she laughed. I even spent an entire night outside, on the roof of City Hall, just because I could. Scythia was stalking her father again one morning, when she happened upon a band of ne'er-do-wells, said Axborn. That's putting it mildly, said Scythia. I'd been vaulting between rooftops to keep up with father when I saw a group of men huddled in an alley. They looked suspicious, so I stopped to listen, but I couldn't quite hear what they were saying. I scaled down the side of the building behind a gutter and crept near to them. So close I could almost reach out and touch them. They were brewing a plan for Flood Day, said Axborn. To bring in small boats armed with cannons and rob the treasury like brigands. Insanity. He shook his head. Oh, brilliant, said Scythia. There's no way the garrison would have been organised enough to defend against that. And to top it off, they were going to kidnap father. Obviously, I couldn't let that stand. But did she go and tell the adults? Said Axborn. No, he laughed. So bold, even at a young age, to think of the trouble you and I might have caused together. No way would I have been able to stand you, dear, said Scythia. I've heard your stories too, you know, and I had no patience for boys whatsoever. Anyhow, Pierce, I followed the brigands around for several days, getting a sense of their comings and goings, skipping school. Eventually, I followed them out of town in the evening and scouted their little camp. Sure enough, they had a small fleet of boats built in a little stand of forest. I snuck out the night before flood day and made my way cautiously to their camp.
She blew it up, Axborn blurted, obviously tickled. He laughed and shook his head. All those brigands with their grand plans foiled by a little girl.
Well, I was kind of tall at least, said Scythia, and you're getting ahead. I've always been proficient at cutting and enchanting gems, Pierce. You may not know, but they're not all just stores of energy like yours. They can be made to hold almost any kind of enchantment you can think of. It's all just a matter of tinkering. Well, I was obsessed with making the smallest gems I could, with the largest explosive force. I was actually on the team providing fireworks for the festivals in Chasm, including Flood Day's End. So I gathered up my best pieces, stole out to the brigands' camp, and affixed them to each of their boats, as well as their storehouses of weapons and food. How did you make them blow without being nearby to trigger them? Pierce asked.
Scythia smiled wickedly.
I introduce a flaw into them. If they're set in iron, they remain stable, but the moment they are removed, the flaw spreads, cracks the gem until it can't hold in its power any longer. Then they blow. I can control the timing by managing the severity of the flaw.
Oh, it must have been spectacular, Axborn bellowed.
It was, Scythia said. The gems blew right as I got back to the city. I smelled the smoke later and the forest actually caught fire. Everyone woke up and I almost got caught out on the streets, but Father was so distracted and surprised he didn't even think to check my room. You should have seen him, out on the cobblestones, barefoot in his nightrobe. He didn't realise it was me who'd struck the brigands until a full week later, when he saw me tinkering with explosive gems again. I was under guard for a year after that, except when they threw me a parade, of course.
And the passion never left her, Axborn said.
He watched his wife with sparkling eyes, then he gave Pierce a serious stare.
Don't get between a good woman and the things she loves, son. Down that path lies broken bones or death.
I'd like to have seen all that, said Pierce.
Oh, you'll see, said Axborn, and his face fell. If what's coming is as bad as you say, you'll see for sure.
So that's why it's your title, Pierce said. Scythia of Chasm. Very astute, Scythia remarked. Scythia, the saviour of Chasm, is not only too long, but a little too self-centred for me. I don't mind at all, my title just shows pride in my home city.
And it's that humility that really drew me to her, said Axborn, eyeing his wife lovingly. Though being deadly and enchanting certainly didn't hurt her chances, he winked.
Yes, she said. The pleasure is all yours. Pierce found many such moments to relive as he waited out the night. He couldn't help but imagine all the stories of times he hadn't heard about, or all the golden memories only Axborn would have remembered. Eventually the darkest night ended, the others awoke, and everyone wore their battle masks as they resumed the hunt for the ultra monstrosity. They found the giant before anyone had caught the sense of a convergence. Agrathor made his strange sighing sound when Scythia had S gather everyone together and told them what she'd heard. Apparently the thing had been walking slowly in this direction since completing its assignment of destruction beneath Chasm Verge. It was surprisingly light-footed, taking long, slow strides that made only a scraping sound as its feet touched the ground. Every once in a while, the massive thing would groan to itself unintelligibly, and this is the sound that Scythia had heard. I think it must have just risen from a rest, Scythia said. Otherwise we might not have caught up to it.
So, now what?
asked Agrathor. His flame eyes flicked from Scythia to Pierce.
Climbed any giants lately?
Well, not one this tall, but Pierce was cut off. We will be like insects on its limbs. It will probably not see or hear us, said S. But if it feels a brush or prick of any kind, it may crush us as we would a stinging fly. We'll need my amulet again, said Scythia. That at least will cover any sounds we make. Sev said, we will need to hear it if we are to anticipate any moves it'll make. Ah, true, said Scythia. Their skin is tough and scarred, said Pierce. At least that of the smaller ones is. It may not feel us at all. One of us can give it a test while everyone else hides. If there's no reaction, everyone should be safe to climb. Then we just wait until it moves up a level or assists in another attack.
Great plan, said Agrathor. I nominate you.
Done, Pierce said.
You're supposed to balk,
Agrathor said, eyes narrowing.
No one wants to go first with something like this.
Why would I balk? Pierce said. I love going first. They had to run to catch up to the giant, slow strides belying its speed. Pierce approached the giant's heels with something between trepidation and excitement. The thing he was about to attempt would be something he'd never forget, if he lived. Each of the ultra-monstrosity's steps took an age to begin and end, so getting a grip on the ridges of its scarred skin was easy. On contact, Pierce looked up the height of the creature for any reaction. There was none. He couldn't really see very far. All he had for light was a dim gem Scythia had given him, so looking up was really just an expression of habit. The giant could be looking right at him and he wouldn't know. The force of movement began to pull at his body as the giant swung its foot forward. Pierce held on with all his strength, braced against the shock of the huge foot's landing. How far should he climb before declaring it safe enough for the others? He moved onto the creature's calf, sticking to the side in the hopes it would be less sensitive. Still, there was no reaction. He wanted to keep heading up, but he began to climb back down instead. He had to get the others. Did you see? He asked when he joined the rest of the group. No reaction. I don't think it can feel anything.
Might explain why it's so hard to debilitate them in battle,
Agrathor said.
They never react to pain. It's why we always assumed they were undead. Maybe they just can't feel at all.
Still, Scythia said, we should take no chances. Be sure to keep your contact light. It will be a long climb with much room for error. S flew close by to everyone as they mounted the monstrosity's foot one by one. If someone slipped, she should be able to give them enough support, even if she couldn't levitate while holding them for long. If everything went wrong, the others were depending on her to fend off the monster until they could escape. It was unclear whether they could slay the thing if need be, but they had agreed that would be a last resort. There was no guarantee there would be any convergences with which to get back home. Agrathor quickly surged into the lead, climbing from ridge to scarred ridge of black flesh with ease. He wouldn't tire. Pierce was strong, but even he felt the burn set in as they approached the monstrosity's knees. He looked down, but the ground was lost in darkness. He'd been counting as best he could though, and thought they must have climbed over 1,000 feet at that point. He glanced over at Sev and Scythia. They both were moving as slow as he, but otherwise seemed to be fine. S flitted by behind them. The farther up he climbed, the more committed he began to feel. It really was either success or death in this situation. Attracting the monstrosity's attention or having his grip fail would both lead to disaster. Which would be less preferable? Probably the former, although falling to his death would be far more embarrassing than being swatted into paste. Of course, he'd survived the last big fall, so maybe it wouldn't be so bad after all. Pierce lapsed into the days of long-term physical exertion until he had mounted the giant's hip. He could feel the thing's leg shifting slowly beneath him as he hunkered down on a wide ridge of scar tissue. Agrathor was just above him, looking down with a grin, armoured legs hanging off the edge of a ridge like a child's from a high chair. Scythia and Sev joined them shortly, and everyone settled in for a rest. "How is everyone holding up?" Scythia asked the group.
Fresh as ever, said Agrathor.
"A little bit sore," said Pierce. Sev didn't comment, but Pierce saw him massaging his arm muscles. "Well, we can all rest our bodies," Scythia said. "I don't recommend stopping for too long, or taking time to sleep. I'm afraid if we lose momentum, we won't get it back." She was probably right, especially without food and water. The longer they stopped, the more their energy levels would drop. No one said much more as they sat, letting their muscles breathe and gazing into the dark. They were about to start again when the sky above lightened ever so slightly, revealing the dim outline of the monstrosity stretching out above them. "Look," said S, pointing. The Underland's pale silver moon was peeking out from behind the edge of some obstruction, revealing perhaps a quarter of the luminescent oblong. It looked farther away than it normally would have from the surface of the Underlands, but Pierce could still see its slow crawl across the sky. He took this as more evidence proving Scythia's theory. What hung above them now must be a hole leading up into the Underlands. The giant stopped moving. Everyone stayed frozen in stillness. They held their collective breath as if the slightest thing could get the monstrosity's attention. Was it looking down at them with its massive, sad face? It was impossible to tell, with the thing's head being partially obscured by the rest of its torso, and backlit besides. The ultra-monstrosity lifted its arms, and its body shuddered with tension as it gripped the lip of the hole above. It heaved, and the lower half of its body swung out wildly as it pulled itself up through the cavity in the earth. The huge humanoid's form rippled visibly as it passed through some intangible membrane. The sensation of passing through the membrane was much like that of a convergence, uncomfortable but less disturbing, more stable. Gorgonbane held on for dear life. The force of the swing was greater than even that of its forward-moving foot as it walked, and Pierce almost lost his grip. He was praying that the giant wouldn't lift itself up and onto its side. If it put even a fraction of its weight on the thigh that Gorgonbane had stopped to rest on, they would die. Thankfully, the giant came out of the hole and onto its knees, then lifted itself up onto both feet again. It stood, and Pierce could just see one of its eyes blinking as if the moonlight were too bright. The monstrosity stayed there for several minutes, either waiting for something or just spacing out. Pierce checked on his comrades. Everyone's eyes were wide with surprise, even Sev's. "Everyone okay?" asked Scythia. "I'm sure we didn't expect that." Everyone signalled they were in one piece. S had followed them up through the air, then perched again on the giant's upper leg. It was nice to be able to see again. Pierce felt like a blind man gaining sight, or as if he'd been sleeping, wading through deep dreams and awoken in the early morning. He wondered where the thing would take them next. "We could climb down off of it now," he said to the others. "We could find a convergence and go from there."
"It's an option," said Agrathor.
"But if we stay, it might take us right to where the action is," said Scythia. This, of course, was tempting to Pierce, but was it wise? "We do not know that it will climb up again, though," said S. It is clear now that the level beneath the Underlands is only a mile or so further down, since the giant was able to reach the gap and climb up. It may be a similar distance from here to Overland. We cannot guess whether the giant will climb up for some other task, or cast another portion of Earth down, or something else. And if it does cause more destruction, said Scythia, the rubble may knock us off of it, or even kill us.
I say we see if it moves again, said Agrathor. Might as well get as close to the next battle as we can. We have to assume it's on its way somewhere, don't we?
Everyone agreed, and they did not have to wait long before the monstrosity started moving. It lurched up onto its feet, and Gorgonbane was swung about again, holding on for dear life. Now its huge feet splashed grossly into the pervasive muck of the Underland, leaving vast footprints in the nasty layer of mud and filth. Pierce was glad not to be down in that stuff again. He was even more relieved to be out of the endless dark of Sub-Underland? He wasn't sure what to call it, but he wasn't eager to return. Adventure was a grand thing, but it was nice to be able to see what was coming at least. Gorgonbane agreed not to climb any higher. The monstrosity had not noticed them hiding on its flank, so there was no sense tempting fate. When the time was right, they could dismount the giant and use a convergence to get back to Overland. Meanwhile, they tightened their belts and tried to ignore the complaints of their stomachs and the dryness of their tongues, and the monstrosity marched slowly onward.